welcome to the very first, dare I say, the inaugural Pabst Mansion Presents. My name is John Harry. Glad you can be with us tonight. We have a whole series of talks scheduled that we'll be announcing more of soon. The ones to keep on your calendar. February 9th, we're partnering with the Encyclopedia of Milwaukee. Their director, Joe Walzer, is going to be giving a talk called German Athens to Old Milwaukee, all about the foundations of German culture in Milwaukee. And then on February 24th, we had some interns at the Pabst Mansion that did some transcriptions and some translations off of some of the letters you can find in the collections. And they're going to be doing a presentation on some of their findings. So that's February 24th. So we'll get those announced on Facebook very, very soon. So stay tuned for that. Tonight's program, I can't wait to hear what this guy has to say. Doug Hoverson is an author. He's written, he writes books about beers in different states. He just takes the biggest project you can find and tackles it. So The Drink That Made Wisconsin Famous is his latest book. So charts everything you could it's a very thorough book. So it charts pretty much everything you could want to find or could find possibly about beer in the Badger State. And of course, Milwaukee being part of that. Doug is also an expert on Milwaukee beer then too. I'll put a link up in the comments to the gift shop at the Pabst Mansion because we do sell Doug's book as well. So if you're interested in learning more about Doug's work and seeing that kind of thing, I'll get that link up. All you got to do is click it. At the end, after Doug's talk, we'll be doing a question and answer. So if you have any questions, make sure that you put those in the comments as well, and we'll see what we can do afterwards. We'll get to a bunch of those too. Without any further ado, for the first Pabst Mansion Presents, I present Doug Hoverson. Doug, take it away.
Thanks, John. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight and to join all of you from a distance here in Minneapolis. And Milwaukee has become a real special place to me because of the beer history, the beer itself, and a lot of the people that I've met who have helped me so much to put this together. And I'd like to thank some of them before I even get started, because many of their images and their collections are used in here, and they provided me with just a ton of information. First, I'd like to thank John and to the Pabst Mansion for welcoming me. The mansion and their staff were quite helpful in pulling together images, and the Milwaukee Historical Society was also great. A couple of individuals in particular that have helped me learn about this while getting going, and then even more since I started work. John Steiner, Leonard Jurgensen, and Dave Olson have all been really essential, and I'm sure I'm leaving out several people who have talked to me as well. You all were a great help. I'd like to talk a little bit about how I got to this project and then start putting the late 19th century Milwaukee brewing industry into a context, if you will, rather than a lot of specifics, show how it played out in society. So I originally started beer research having been inspired by this particular ad, which I saw in a newspaper in Moorhead, Minnesota. And I was working on some things with the Red River Valley and the railroads cutting through there. And I had never heard of John Erickson's brewery. I didn't know there'd ever been a brewery in Moorhead. About all I knew about Minnesota beer at that time was Hams and Schmidt and Grain Belt. And I was vaguely aware of that cute little Shells thing down in New Ulm. So I started getting interesting and wondered, all right, well, does anyone know anything about the Moorhead Brewery? So one thing led to another, and I mentioned to a few people that maybe I'd start writing a book on it someday. And then they kept asking me how the book was coming along, so I guess I was stuck. I was really lucky to get adopted by the University of Minnesota Press, and they helped me bring out The Land of Amber Waters, which came out in 1997. They then, 2007. Right, 2007. Getting ahead of myself here. And after this came out, they asked, would you like to do Wisconsin? We think that should be your next project. And I ask them, are you crazy? I mean, Wisconsin could end up taking me 10 years to do. It could be twice as thick. But the groundwork was actually already laid in this ad, because while I was interested in Erickson's Moorhead Brewery at the time, I also had noticed the Northwestern Bottling Company, which was handling Philip Best's beer. And at the time, I really didn't know anything about Philip Best, which just shows how much I had to learn, because, of course, Philip Best then will later turn the brewery over to his son-in-law, Fred Pabst. But that laid the groundwork for this book, which just came out in the fall of 2019. And it's about 6.5 pounds. So it turned out to be just a really great resource. And a lot of people have been using it to find out other things and to extend the work that's in it. My research took me to a lot of different libraries, the Library of Congress, the Harvard Business School, and a couple of National Archives depositories, which weren't very photogenic and just did not make it into the slideshow. I was able to work with a lot of different kinds of primary source documents, with tax records of all types, with census records, with some of the industry journals. And ones like the American Brewers Review were really helpful, because my German is okay, but not with the technical language. So with journals like this that were published in dual columns, English and German, I kind of had a Rosetta Stone so I could learn some of the technical language and figure out what more of the articles were talking about. There were some great government resources that told me about how the breweries were built, what their safety records were, their number of employees, and all sorts of little details. One of the final people I want to thank is my photographer, Bob Foch, because throughout the book, I'm very well aware that when people pick it up on the shelf, they don't look at it and say, wow, great paragraph. He used the semicolon perfectly here. But they do look at it and say, wow, there's some great photos of old beer stuff in here. And that's all due to Bob's work, and I was blessed to have him with me on both books. So I'm not going to do a ton with the earliest days of brewing in Milwaukee. Most of that story is fairly well known, even though a lot of what is known about it isn't necessarily supported by the historical facts we have before us. But we do know that the beginning breweries were fairly small. They were family businesses that would occasionally hire on some fellow countrymen or some other family members. Where I'd really like to start this is just before America enters the Civil War. And so at this point, Milwaukee had somewhere between 20 to 24 breweries in 1860, depending on which records you trust more. Most of them are still these very small family firms, 2 to 4 employees, often just family members. Only 4 of these 24 breweries had more than 8 employees, and the most any of them had was 11, and that was Sands Ale Brewery. So the lager breweries at this point were still generally small. The average production of the top 20 was about 2,800 barrels with 31 gallons in a barrel. And the median production was about 750 barrels. So there were a few 8,000 to 10,000 barrel breweries that were bringing up the average. And we'll see that a 10,000 barrel brewery will shortly be almost literally a drop in the bucket. So even during the 1860s, just after the Civil War, some of Milwaukee's breweries are starting to get much more imposing in size. So this was the Melms Brewery on the south side. It's known as the South Side Brewery on Virginia. And it's shown here a few years later when it had become Best's South Side Brewery, later, again, a branch of Pabst. But the stunning building in the background with its Gothic features, according to reports at the time, was sometimes mistaken by tourists for one of the cathedrals in the town or some other great church. And the brewery complexes were beginning to expand with their malt houses and the stables, which can be seen here. And in addition, the Southside Brewery also had river access, which was very important to the Great Lakes trade. In many of the Best or Pabst images, you will see the steamer, the Comet, which was the ship that Captain Pabst was the captain of during his prime when he was a captain on the Great Lakes. So the beer at this time was sold in several different locations. The most obvious for a brewery was to sell it on its own premises, much like today's modern tap rooms. And we have very few pictures of them, but we have this somewhat blurry picture of the beer garden at Fred Miller's Plank Road Brewery. And you can see the well-known image of the brewery in the lower right foreground with the structure of the beer garden back up on top of the hill. And the German culture, of course, was very enthusiastic about having beer at all of its events, especially those connected with German organizations like the Sangerbund. And this is an 1868 picture. And the type of beer they had was Philip Best's beer, and it can just barely be seen in the diamond-shaped sign located on that rather large keg on top of the wagon in the back. But it wasn't just at picnics and beer gardens that the beer was found. Of course, the vast majority of the beer was sold in saloons. And this particular one is interesting to me for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a saloon in St. Paul, Minnesota, so it's a little closer to home for me. And this one was clearly taken in the early 1890s because we can see the two Pabst signs, these wonderful corner signs on the side of the door, but we can also just above see one of the old three-piece signs, which is still the Philip Best sign. And these had pretty much faded out of use by the 1880s, but they retained it here. One small bit of information here shows some of the rivalry which the Milwaukee Brewers will have to contend with, because this sign just inside the door to our left of the barkeeper is actually for Anheuser-Busch beers. And it's possibly might have been selling a little bit of bottled Budweiser along with their draft Pabst products. The corner signs were one of the great landmarks of most urban areas at the time, and they were always great works of art. This one, which we know is after 1878 because the medals there proclaim the date, had some quartz, small flakes and ground quartz put into the gold paint so that the gold letters would light up when a light hit them in the dark. But the saloon trade, as important as it wasn't going to be enough to help the Milwaukee breweries develop and really explode to the size they became. The biggest factor there was actually going to be the ready availability of bottled lager. And this is a fairly early bottle of Schlitz. It would probably be the early 1880s because it is proclaiming that it was the brewery's own bottling. Most of the breweries, when they started bottling in the 1870s, used a private bottler that was often associated with the brewery, had a contract with the brewery, but was not actually part of the brewery. So, for example, the Philip Best bottlers were Stam and Meyer. And you can see that their bottling house was just across the road from the Southside Brewery and located on the railroad tracks for ease of shipment. Many of Milwaukee's great brewers had similar arrangements. So, for example, Franz Falk had an arrangement with the Gunther and Company And we know that even fairly early, they were shipping these beers to a large geographic area, because there are other examples of these trade cards, some of which are in the collection of the Milwaukee Historical Society, which were printed in Spanish and designed for the Caribbean trade. The Milwaukee Brewing Association, according to Milwaukee brewing historian John Steiner, was most likely a company that was set up so that Philip Best could experiment with bottled beer a little bit more without necessarily risking the company's name on it. This would be kind of similar to the way in the 1970s that Miller decided they were going to call their brand Light from Miller at first rather than Miller Lite, so that they could protect the name in case it didn't turn out so well. As we know, in both the case of Light and Best's bottled products, things did work well. The prevalence of bottled beer made it necessary to have agencies all over the country to handle it. And Philip Best in particular had branches throughout the upper Midwest. We see on the left here their South Chicago branch, because they had two in that city. And we have the very western look of their Kansas City branch pictured on the right. As the breweries begin to engage in the shipping, they have to develop a lot of technology. They have to develop refrigerated railroad cars to handle the product, but they also need to develop much larger home breweries. So we see their rapid expansion. The Schlitz Brewery, as pictured in this particular label, by this point in the late 1880s, early 1890s, was able to brew about 600,000 barrels a year. And compare that to just 25 years earlier, when 10,000 barrels was the biggest Milwaukee could offer. One of the other things that a lot of modern viewers see in this particular illustration are the smoking chimneys. And while some modern eyes might think that that's incredible pollution, a horrible carbon footprint, to a viewer in the late 19th century, this was a beautiful sight, because the belching chimneys were a sign that products were being made and people were being employed and money was being made and the city was prospering. The breweries in particular were renowned for their tall smokestacks, and they rivaled each other to see who could build the newest, biggest smokestack. In order to sell all the beer made at these new breweries through their agencies, they needed to advertise. And some of the more spectacular forms of advertising took place at major industrial expositions. They could have been at this particular one is, I believe, one of the Milwaukee industrial expositions, but they were held all over the country, and also, in addition, the World's Fairs. The 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago is, of course, especially important to the Pabst Mansion, because the pavilion that was used for the Pabst display at that event was later brought back to Milwaukee and reassembled as part of the Pabst Mansion. Here we see an incredible tower of the early Philip Best beer, the Tower of the Bottles. As time went on throughout the late 19th century, the brewers began to expand the lines of their bottled products. And here we see from the 1890s, Blatz's lineup, and they had a private stock, which was most likely a Pilsner style beer, a high quality lager, a Wiener or a Vienna beer, which was typically amber in color, the export, which appears to be roughly the same color and the Münchner, or a Munich Dark, which was typically a chocolate-covered beer with a little bit more sweetness to it. Export, in this particular case, didn't necessarily mean it was a beer that was being shipped overseas. Export was often a name just given to the bottled product of a brewery to indicate that it was available for shipping elsewhere. You'll also notice that the Blatz Malt Tonic was available as well in bottles. And this was a product that was not conceived, as some think, as a reaction to Prohibition. But this is a product that dates back to the 1880s and was really a way for the brewers to get into the patent medicine market. The malt tonics were recommended for nursing mothers and people with digestive complaints and any possible thing. They were a nice money maker for the brewery because you could use the equipment and your raw materials, but you didn't have to occupy a whole lot of your fermentation tanks. You could move it through more rapidly. It's also noteworthy in this one that they make a major deal out of the fact that you should look for Blatz on the cork. One of the things that I found in my research was there was actually such a thing as beer counterfeiting. Unscrupulous bottlers would get their hands on some bottles of a major well-known brewer, possibly even by stealing them, but perhaps by buying them. They would fill them with a lower priced beer and then send them out as if it was Pabst Blue Ribbon or Schlitz or Blatz and pocket the difference. So brewers had to fight back against this either by having branded corks or eventually branded crown caps. So even with bottled beer, having places where you can sell your beer on your own locations was still important to the brewers. And it even moved up a level into their advertising world because they were trying to associate their product not just with the saloons, but with high-class entertainment, with elaborate venues that would indicate that this was a good thing in a very desirable lifestyle. So Schlitz Park was one of the best known. As you can see, perhaps from the letterhead here, the park could host up to 20,000 people at a time, 4 bowling alleys, a restaurant, bandstands, marching bands, and was one of the great resorts for the people of Milwaukee. Schlitz Park actually was host in 1878 to one of the first things that I discovered in my research, which really sounds like it would be a modern beer festival where you could get the brands of many different brewers all in the same venue. In 1878, Milwaukee hosted a relief fundraiser for southern states that were hit by yellow fever. This was really one of the big social events of the season. President Rutherford B. Hayes himself attended, and the Milwaukee Brewers donated kegs for the event in rough proportion to their size at the time. So Best and Schlitz each donated 20 kegs, Blatz 15, Falk 10, Miller, which was smaller at the time than it would be in comparison in the 20th century, donated 8. The Gettleman and Borchert breweries each 5, and the Oberman Brewery each 4. In addition, a lot of the Weiss beer producers also donated soda water. So one of the few opportunities at the time where you could just go from stand to stand at the same event and have brewers of different breweries all at once. Of course, not to be outdone, Pabst will have their own opulent setting up on Whitefish Bay, where you could arrive by train, and you could arrive by boat, or of course by carriage. And one of the impressive things about these various venues is they have left us some elements of material culture. So they had their own glasses for Whitefish Bay Park. And one of the neat things about this is you can track the year by who was leasing the park and operating it for the Pabst company at that time. In this case, Mr. Konopka. There, of course, were indoor venues as well. The Schlitz Palm Garden was one of the most famous such gardens in the world at the time. And the big Milwaukee Brewers also were heading out east. And if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. And the big breweries, in particular Pabst and Schlitz, moved into New York with a vengeance. Pabst had several hotels there, several big restaurants at various locations, and as well as Coney Island. And for some of Pabst's hotel properties, they specifically brought out bartenders from Milwaukee so that they could advertise that the beer was being poured in the Milwaukee style by Milwaukee experts. The advertising, of course, was incredibly competitive, and companies then as now tried to capitalize on important world events. So when the Spanish-American War erupted and then was over briefly in the 1880s, in 1898, all of Milwaukee's breweries that were shipping to a national audience capitalized on it. Pabst in particular produced this poster, which has several of the war heroes of the Spanish-American War. It has four generals who have the golden sashes on, and three of America's great naval commanders. And I had found references in newspapers that this poster was available to Pabst dealers and customers as far away as Singapore and Hong Kong. The advertising led to great profits, and the profits enabled the beer barons to have that name, to become among the wealthiest citizens in the city and the state, and in some cases, even the country. They were able to build great homes. This one was actually built by Charles Melms, the original owner of the Southside Brewery. I'm sorry, this is the Pabst House, which was located at 828 Chestnut near the Empire Brewery, which was the northern of the Pabst, the best, later the Pabst breweries. And this would, of course, be the one that would precede the Pabst Mansion, which we know today. Pabst's brother-in-law, Emil Schandine, moved into the old Melms house, which was near the Southside Brewery, and lived here until his untimely passing. But the brewers were celebrated by the people of the community in many cases. We have some interesting records of celebrations that were put together when the brewers returned from European trips that the wealthy families of the time could take. For example, Henry Eline from Schlitz came back from a 6-month tour to Europe, and in 1885, about 400 employees turned out with bands and a torchlight parade to welcome him back. And his brother August got a similar welcome a few years later, and so did Captain Pabst when he came back from a trip to Europe and the Middle East in 1895. So it's hard to tell at this point whether these were genuine outpourings of love for the proprietor or whether this was simply an opportunity for the workers to party on the company's dollar and open a few kegs of their product in celebration. But the lionization of the brewers was continued in song. The breweries took advantage of opportunities to promote themselves for major events in the city. The Grand Army of the Republic's encampment in 1889 in Milwaukee was a spectacular draw, and there are accounts of the veterans touring all of the great breweries from which they could get a souvenir like this. Now, there were some growing pains, of course, as well. And the breweries sometimes closed, sometimes consolidated. For example, the Falk Young and Borchert Brewery was the combination of the Falk Brewery and the Young and Borchert Brewery, which of course was a combination as well. And after a couple of fires, the Falk Young and Borchert Company would be purchased by Pabst and become part of that. One of the big prizes in that, of course, was to get Philip Young, who is regarded as one of the best brewmasters in the country. There were also a few breweries even then that resisted the move to consolidation. And with some of the same pride that Milwaukee's craft breweries tout their independence today, the Fogel Brewery proudly proclaimed at the bottom of its label that it was not in any trust. These were the days in which the giant combines were buying up all of the companies in any particular business. And brewing was not exempt from people trying to create monopolies. But Milwaukee was quite resistant to the trend. There were always rumors of English capitalists coming in to try and buy up Pabst Schlitz and Blatz and pull them all into one big company. The only one that ever became part of one of those combinations was Blatz, and even that was only temporary. Brewers had other problems to deal with as well. One of the most noteworthy ones, of course, was fire. And in a world where much of the brewery construction was wood, you have grain all over the brewery, you have fodder for the horses, you have wood, you have both light and power being provided by fire. It was a recipe for disaster. And in fact, the Empire Brewery was the site of a spectacular fire in December 1879. As mentioned earlier, Falk burned down a couple of times. There were major disasters at most breweries. Now, not that I am arguing that this was intentional, but it turned out that the 1870s and 1880s were a really good time to have your brewery burned down if you had enough capital. Again, I'm not alleging any sort of misdeeds here, but it was at that time period that new equipment was being developed that would help automate the processes and make brewing much more efficient. So, for example, after a fire, Blatz decided to go all the way and be the first all-electric powered brewery. This would confine the fires to the machinery and would make their operations much more efficient. But because of a fire, they had the ability to make that big changeover rather than doing it incrementally. Of course, fire also meant that it would be in the brewery's best interests to help prevent fires. And of course, some like Philip Best were able to create their own fire department. So bringing up the employees here is kind of the transition point in the talk, because I'd like to move a little bit away from the beer barons themselves and talk about the many hundreds of people who worked for them. As we noted earlier, in the 1860s, to have a dozen people at your brewery was a pretty significant accomplishment. But this will grow exponentially over the next few years. We will have 100 employees at Best, soon to be Pabst, in 1870. 10 years later, 235. Just 6 years later, almost double that again. And in the same year, we know that Schlitz had 350 workers, Blatz employed 175. Working in a brewery was very dangerous. There were many things that could go wrong, between fire, the equipment, falling in a boiling vat of water or wort, but there were compensations. The wages were much better than they were in most other businesses. You could earn between $10 to $13 for even unskilled work, and very few workers were getting more than $10 even for skilled work. So I have a rough comparison to $1,900 in today's wages. So working at a brewery was a good living wage for the time period. As the breweries are beginning to grow, they are having still a fairly paternalistic, fraternal sort of culture among the workers. These workers of Miller here are pictured all gathered around Fred Miller in the center with a couple of the kids all enjoying a beer. And of course, when you've got 20 people in the company, it's a lot easier to have that type of fraternal situation than it is when you have 200, 800, or 2,000. So often when we think of brewing, we think of the people working in the brew house itself as the brewery workers. And by the 1880s, relatively few of a brewery's employees were actually employed in the brew house. You would need some to stir the mash and to test the wort, but most of the brewers were doing something else at the time. And as I indicated earlier, what's really going to also drive employment is the increase in the sale and shipment of bottled beer. And this required a lot of specialized labor. Again, some of it skilled, some of it unskilled. One of the things that came about because of the need for skilled labor is the increase in the number of brewing schools around the country. And Hankey's school in Milwaukee was one of these. And this is a wonderful calendar because it shows the cutaway view of the brewery school where they had access to all of the possible equipment. They could learn every part of the trade, including bottling. And if I were allowed to time travel, the room I would really like to visit is the library shown in the upper center, because I'm sure many of those books are no longer widely available for research purposes. Now, to compare this bottling house with one only about 10 years later here will show how the growth of the breweries exploded and how interesting it was for the public. If you will look inside the blue box to the left, you will notice several well-dressed patrons on a catwalk observing the process of the bottling. And while much of it was mechanized, you will also see hundreds of workers here, many of whom are women who are labeling the bottles and wrapping the bottles. And in many cases, hiring women and children was a real money saver for the brewery because they could be paid anywhere from $275 a week. Sometimes older boys might earn $750 a week. So it was a real money saver. It was somewhat worrying for Milwaukee authorities because by this point there were already age limits for employment and there were compulsory school laws. The breweries did claim that they required certificates from parents pledging that the children were at least 14 years old. Of course, the families were likely to sign anyway because this was another source of income for their family, which might be desperately needed by new immigrants. While, alas, this picture has somewhat faded over time, we have a photograph instead of a stylized engraving of, in this case, the bottle house at Blatt's, which shows the enormous number of people working there, again, with women largely wrapping the bottles, men packing them and moving around. One of the more interesting bottle jobs is this one here, where these men have wrapped bottles that they are going to then pack into barrels for shipment and pack the barrels with hay or straw to prevent the bottles from rattling around too much and cracking each other. All of these bottling situations required many more workers, and you also had skilled craftsmen like the carpenters who were in charge of making and repairing the cases that the bottles were shipped in. In the early 1860s, in the late 1860s, there began to be national labor unions throughout the country. The first was the aptly named National Labor Union, which was founded in 1867. And in 1863, we have the first strike in a Milwaukee brewery that I've discovered. And it was a walkout at Philip Best's brewery. And the accounts I found didn't indicate how many workers were involved. There would have been a couple hundred employed overall at best at that point. But because 1873 was the year of one of the great financial panics, the workers were all replaced. The Milwaukee Sentinel reported that a squad of police was dispatched to the brewery, quote, as trouble was threatened, but there was no violence and production continued on. The most noteworthy year for brewery activism was in 1886, which was a significant year throughout the country. In May of that year, there was the Haymarket Affair in Chicago, where there were at least 11 dead and many others injured. And even in Milwaukee that year, you had the conflict at the Bayview roller mills, where at least 6 laborers were killed. And brewery workers also went on strike at this time. And it turned out that May was a really good time to go on strike, because this is when the breweries were ramping up production for the peak summer season. So a strike in May would have had extra force with the brewers. And of course, at this time, the brewers have large facilities, and this is Pabst in the 1880s. And during the 1886 strike, there was again quite a bit of labor violence, but Philip Best and Captain Pabst were determined to make sure that none of that affected their brewery. And there are reports in the newspaper of the time that Pabst had ordered the coopers at the brewery to make several hundred wooden clubs to use in case the brewery was stormed, and also that they were fitting hoses to the hot water tanks and even to the ammonia tank so that they could turn these on anyone who stormed the brewery. As it turned out, there was no violence at the breweries, partially because the big brewers realized that they had too much of a financial stake in all of this beer going to waste, especially that with which they had already made. So they brought on the people that were in charge of the cooling systems. They hired them back quickly. They acceded to the wage demands almost immediately, and the brewery workers continued to be among the best paid in town. The brewery workers were also some of the most lionized in town. It's hard to imagine workers for any other business having competitions like there were at some of the local parishes to pick the most popular brewery foreman. There were some ups and downs with the labor throughout the next several years. In the early 1890s, there was some additional strikes and other turmoil. There was one in 1888, where there was a strike with some of the maltsters. The brewers were asked in solidarity to boycott beer from their own breweries, which created a situation where out-of-town beer was served at the Milwaukee Brewery Workers' masked ball. And that was the final straw for most of the people involved. The unions were broken at that point. They did manage to make a recovery. And by 1912, pretty much all of the workers in Milwaukee's breweries, including women in the bottle houses, were all unionized. So the growing pains that came along with the growth of Milwaukee's breweries ended up causing some turmoil, but ultimately the workers benefited, if not as much as the proprietors, certainly more than some of their fellows in other businesses. So it's about at this point where I'd like to bring the formal part of this talk and open it up for some questions. But I'd just like to throw out some admiration for Milwaukee's brewers today. They make some amazing products. I am often sorry that I can't get enough of them here in Minneapolis, but I will hope you will continue to patronize. They all make some great beer. And what'll you have?
Now you can. There we go. I don't know what happened. Sorry about that, everybody. What I was saying, thank you for everybody. I don't know what I had my headphones plugged in the whole time. Technology. So, Doug, some of the things that people wanted you to revisit was the wage discussion. As far as the wages, you said were really good. And so, can you elaborate more on that and kind of revisit that? So, you said they were making $10 per what? Per week, per, not per hour, I'm guessing.
No.
And how that might, how did that correspond to the profits that the breweries were making at that time?
So it was $10 a week, and that was some of the lower wages. It could be much more for skilled workers. And if you were one of the brewmasters, you were on salary often for several $100s a month. So where that would compare to the owners, I really don't have a good set of figures for the ratio of employee pay to ownership pay. So I wish I had that ratio. Clearly, even though the brewery workers were well paid relative to other industry workers in the city, they were not in any way any sort of profit sharing or anything like that. So there was a clear class difference.
Sure. Somebody, where would it go? To know, where was the Empire Brewery, and maybe give, if you could, kind of play a land.
I think you just broke up.
Maybe paint a picture of where some of the breweries maybe were in Milwaukee, especially as the ones got absorbed or consolidated into the bigger operations.
Okay, I wish I'd put a map together for that one. The Empire Brewery was very near. It was actually on the land that is today the Pabst complex. So its official address was on Chestnut, and eventually the Pabst Brewery's address will be 917 Chestnut, though obviously it spreads out for several more blocks. The Schlitz Brewery that is still present on the landscape today was a few blocks away from there at first, and that was really its second big iteration. Blatt's, some of those buildings still exist today around the Milwaukee School of Engineering campus. And this is one of those situations where I actually have to go back to the book, because trying to keep approximately 800 brewery locations and addresses in my head is kind of daunting, especially when I'm trying to keep Minnesota in my head and also thinking about Michigan. So the earliest of the, so I think I said earlier, the Southside Brewery was on Virginia,
Right.
what was then Virginia and Hanover is now Oregon. And Pabst, we've just spoken about. Just going to look for the first location of Schlitz. So the first location of Schlitz was on Chestnut as well. The address best known was 420 Chestnut, which then became Juneau, and then it moved to the 3rd and Galena Street operation in 1868.
Okay.
So Schlitz was already recognizing, just coming out of the Civil War, they needed a much bigger facility than they had. And so that rapid building growth is happening right after the Civil War. There is capital available, there is labor available, which wasn't true during the war. And of course, immigration has really started again, and you have a population which is very interested in drinking your product.
Which helps.
And obviously, Miller was where Miller is.
Right. Yes. Question from Michael. How did Milwaukee Brewers come to dominate the Chicago beer scene? And that could be a whole talk unto itself.
I think
but
that talk at one point. This is one where I'd be happy to have some of your input as well, John, because it's a big question and it's hotly debated. And it's clearly more than just the Chicago fire, though that was definitely a factor because a number of the Chicago breweries burned at that time. And I think some of it also was the fact that the Milwaukee brewers were shipping a lot more than the Chicago breweries, so they were gaining more of a reputation, partially because there was no way the city of Milwaukee could drink everything that the Milwaukee brewers made. I think there was also another factor was that some of the Chicago breweries were still ale breweries. And as lager started to push ale out everywhere, the lager breweries had a particular advantage. And some of it was just plain marketing. Pabst and Schlitz and Blatz and Falk did a great job getting their beer out there, and they made a quality product. You know, a couple of books have been or are being written on Chicago's brewing industry. And while they had some very important brewers, none of them ever quite rose to the level of the great Milwaukee International Brewers. And it's not altogether clear why.
Sure. I think to add on to that, I think you're right, absolutely, on the marketing too. You will find later even, Milwaukee has become synonymous with good beer. And so it's almost like New Orleans with jazz and Nashville with country music and, Kansas City or wherever with barbecue, it's Milwaukee with beer. And so there were places putting out Milwaukee style beer.
Right.
And so I think one of the things with Chicago too, that especially Schlitz did, is they were really good at purchasing real estate.
Right.
So one of the reasons I think that Chicago got overtaken by Milwaukee at a certain point was they bought all the corners. So even in Chicago today, you can go down and there's a lot of Schlitz tied houses with their imagery still on them.
Right. Schlitz and Pabst and to a lesser degree Blatz moved in there heavily, and all of those big breweries had their own real estate departments, and I've done some of the work in the Blatz files up at UW Milwaukee, where you can go really deep into the weeds on them sending bar furniture back and forth to saloons and all sorts of little details like that. So they kept a very hands-on approach to the saloons they owned all over the country.
Absolutely. You can still find, well, my wife and I were in an antique store here in Milwaukee, and there was a set of Tide House Schlitz chairs. They're $400 a piece, and you can't sit on them. So that's where that conversation started and ended. When space is a premium, right? As far as we might have to give a talk about Milwaukee and Chicago just at some point. Was there a higher German population? I mean, Chicago is bigger than Milwaukee even then, but was the German population comparable?
I don't have the absolute numbers, but the percentage in Milwaukee was clearly higher. Many more ethnic groups were coming through Chicago in greater numbers. And while they were represented in both cities, you had more Bohemians in Chicago, you had more Irish in Chicago, you had, I think, more of the Southern Europeans in Chicago in particular. There were plenty of them in Milwaukee, but there was just more of everything in Chicago to kind of overwhelm the German presence. I think the Germans also got to Milwaukee in a time where they could share in running the city. I mean, it was, of course, still primarily run by the Yankees and the Scots-Irish, but the Germans were able to move their way up into the social and political elite more so than Chicago, I think.
Sure. So you've done a book on Minnesota and Wisconsin, and now I heard you mention that because I personally, we had talked, and I know you were up in the air between Iowa and Michigan, and
Well,
you've decided on Michigan as for your next book.
It's still up in the air. I'm still doing preliminary research on both. I've submitted book proposals to my people, and I'm waiting to see which they'll do. In a way, I'm hoping they'll let me at least start them both simultaneously, because I've made a lot of I've had a lot of conversations with collectors and historians from both areas, and I'd like to be able to work with them in their collections while they're still young enough to do so.
Sure.
And while I'm still young enough to do so.
I was going to say, is this a 50-state project?
I think not.
Okay. Well, some of the states would be a really short book anyway.
Some of them were, and I don't think I need to, because there's a lot of other really smart people out there who are taking an interest in their own states. A couple of weeks ago, I was in a conversation with a young scholar from Oklahoma who's taking a lot of interest and wants to do something similar down there. So, it's nice to be in a situation where I don't have to do it all, because there's lots of other people that know a lot.
Which is great. I'm just putting your book back in the chat here in case anybody wants to take a look at it. Well, I can't wait to see what the next book is. For your sake, I hope it's Michigan, because I have family in Iowa and I'd rather go to Michigan. But you never know. We have a couple of talks coming up, as I mentioned at the beginning, February 9th with the culture. Oh, I keep on blurting out there about German culture in Milwaukee. German Athens to Old Milwaukee is what that's called. And then February 24th, we have an event with the UW Milwaukee and their transcription team that had some interns at the Pabst Mansion that transcribed some of the letters, and we're going to talk about what the significance of those are too. So that's coming up on February 24th. So stay tuned on Facebook. We'll get those events put out shortly. But Doug, thank you so much for hanging out with us tonight. And I know you're drinking water now, and I hope a beer is the next thing that you get to consume.
Yeah, there will be one in the evening, yes.
Oh, good. Only one, though, because it's a Tuesday? I don't know.
I didn't say what size.
Okay. Good stuff. All right. Well, thank you, Doug. Hopefully we can have you back again for Pabst Mansion Presents.
I'd love to. There's several other great questions that we didn't get to, so we'll put those on tap for the next time.
Cool. Everybody stay safe, and we hope to see you on February 9th for our next Pabst Mansion Presents. Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.